Hello, greetings and welcome to United Europe's panel discussion on how can migration policy better competitiveness, unity and diversity of Europe. We are a non-profit association and we have as our goals indeed these three things: the unity, diversity and competitiveness of Europe. If you'd like to join us and support our work, please go to our website at www.unitedeurope.eu. Thanks to Matthew Callan, and it is him that did all of the research and all of the chasing and contacting of the participants, and without whom this event would not have been possible. For our panel today, we have Mr. Gerald Knaus as our keynote. Mr. Knaus is an Austrian social scientist based in Berlin. He is the founding director of the think tank European Stability Initiative and author of Can Intervention Work with Eurojust Europe in 2011 and the Spiegel bestseller Which Borders Do We Need in German in 2021. We also are joined by Asita Kanko, who is a member of the European Parliament and vice chair of European Conservatives and Reformist Group. She is a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. Mr. Martin Schuller is a co-chairman of the Schuller Group, a family conglomerate focused on sustainable packaging and logistics. He's on the board of the Association of Family Entrepreneurs in Bavaria, honorary consul of Togo, and on various other boards. He very recently co-authored the book Africa First, which outlines the chance of a century to end poverty and how we can seize it. Africa does not need handouts, but positive impulses. It is therefore high time for Europe to invest instead of just help. We also have Professor Florian Bieber. Florian Bieber holds the Jean Monnet Chair on Urbanization in Southeastern Europe at the University of Graz, Austria, and is the coordinator of the Balkans European Policy Advisory Group. We were expecting to be joined by Mr. International Organization of Migration, and he may yet be replaced by Mr. Manfred Popazzi at short notice. And Mr. Popazzi is the Senior Regional Advisor for Europe and Central Asia in the Office of the Director General at the International Organization of Migration headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Without further ado, please, Mr. Knaus, you have the floor for the keynote, and we'll be following up by a 4-minute intervention by each of our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this opportunity, and I welcome this debate on a topic that could not be more important. We've seen it in the context of the recent debates on Afghanistan. We've seen it in the context of Europe's search for a combination of legality, humanity, and control. The issue is Europe's borders, and in particular the issue of migration and irregular migration. And let me start perhaps with 3 points on where we stand and then go to 5 steps to actually solve some of our problems. Now, where are we at Europe's borders when it comes to irregular migration? Europe's borders in the last years and in 2021 are the deadliest in the world. According to the International Organization for Migration, in the first months of this year until early September, half of all dead migrants are dead on Europe's borders. So the Mediterranean, particularly the central Mediterranean, is the deadliest border in the world. These borders are also cruel. If we look, and I recently saw at a film festival, I was invited to participate in a debate on a film on miners trying to go from Greece to other parts of the European Union, trying to cross the so-called Balkan route, but it's really the Greece-Germany route, because they try to get from one bit of the EU to another bit. The way these miners are treated daily at Europe's external borders, in Croatia, in Hungary, violates the Convention for the Protection of the Rights of Children, the Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, EU law, the Fundamental Rights Charter. I mean, every bit of legislation the EU has adopted is violated daily at these borders. And that is finally the crisis of the rule of law. If the European Union passes laws, if member states sign conventions, if the highest court of the EU in Luxembourg gives judgments, as it did in December last year in the case of Hungary's asylum law, and these are not implemented, It's not just an issue of refugee rights, it's also an issue of the rule of law. Now, what are we to do faced with this crisis? Because that is, of course, in any democracy, the key question: how do you win majority support for a different policy that governments are then willing and able to implement? There are three options. One, the status quo, which for many reasons I think is unacceptable. Second, the semi-open borders we had in 2015, 2016, both in the Aegean and in the central Mediterranean, which is for many reasons impossible to go back to. It's politically impossible. No government would return to a situation where 180,000 people crossed from Libya to Italy and were all brought to Italy by European boats, or 1 million people crossed in 12 months from Turkey to Greece. There is no government in Europe that would support this. But secondly, these borders were even deadlier than they are today. The deadliest year in the central Mediterranean was the year 2016, when almost 4,600 people died. So the semi-open borders of 2015, 2016 are not an option politically and from a moral and humanitarian point of view. The status quo is in violation of our core rules. So what we need, thirdly, and this is what I'll focus on in the last minutes of my presentation, we need a different form of humane control. It is legitimate to reduce irregular migration. But if we want to reduce irregular migration, in line with current legislation, values, and conventions, we need to do, and I suggest, 5 steps. Now, let me be concrete. These 5 steps are linked to different specific problems. First, the central Mediterranean. We need to rescue those at risk of drowning, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't encourage more people getting into boats, as it did between 2014 and 2018. The only way to do that is to have a revival of rescue missions combined with agreements to return those we rescue, who can be returned because they do not need protection in Europe, to other countries. That requires agreements with other countries, offers to other countries. It requires cut-off dates. But this is, and I'll get to the second point, what we did offer in 2016 in the statement between the EU and Turkey. This statement in March 2016 reduced the number of people crossing in the Aegean from 1 million in the 12 months before the statement to 26,000 in the 12 months after. It also reduced the number of people who drowned from 1,100 dead people, half of them children, in the 12 months before to 80 in the 12 months after. But it required us to offer Turkey financial support for the refugees in Turkey and the promise of orderly resettlement. Which gets me to the third point. If it is possible through partners and through strategic returns, following a procedure to assess that people are not returned into inhumane conditions, to reduce irregular migration, which should be the goal, then there needs to be resettlement to actually bring people who do need protection and who our societies are willing to accept and welcome safely to our countries. Resettlement, there are 2 very good models for Europe. I've been proposing this with colleagues in Germany. One model is Sweden, which every year resettles 5,000 people. They don't need to take risks. They don't need smugglers. They don't risk their lives. It doesn't only have to be young boys or men who risk their lives because they have the courage to brave terrible journeys. Resettlement can bring families who then quickly integrated. Sweden brings in 5,000 a year. That is 0.05% of its population. If Germany would do that, it would be 40,000 people a year. For Austria, it would be 4,000. So these are numbers that could be managed. And with resettlement, people can be integrated very much better. The second model is Canada, which combines resettlement, the idea, with sponsorship. So citizens, church groups, associations, universities can sponsor refugees who can then be brought in within a ceiling, a number set every year by the central government. The central government checks whether people meet the criteria of refugee, but then citizens can sponsor. My fourth point then concerns those who are already in Europe, we have a real problem with a lot of people who ought to leave because they didn't get protection, but who've been here for many years. We need to be realistic. The people who've been here for many years, particularly from West African countries, will not be returned. The countries will not participate. So we need agreements with West African countries to actually have a cutoff date, to immediately return all those who've been sentenced for crimes, to offer others who are here, which is the vast majority, a chance to actually integrate and use their presence, become a bridge between our societies and their home countries, and to then have a cutoff date after which these countries prepare to take their citizens back immediately, unless they qualify for refugee status, in return for organized mobility. Now, we've presented a plan like this as a model, a pilot project with the Gambia, but this could be used with other West African countries. And again, Germany could go ahead and show how this could work. Last point, and I started with this, the unacceptable situation of minors that are trying to get from Greece to Germany or France. It is crazy that the European Union cannot find a better way for these people. It's a finite group. They are now in Greece. They are treated there in such a way that they have every incentive to try to cross, leave the EU, go into the Balkans, and then try to re-enter. A group of countries that take seriously the Convention for the Protection of Children should sit down with Greece and work out a plan. You know, it's crazy to assume that all these minors will stay in Greece. It is madness to force them into the hands of smugglers where they suffer horrendously on the route in the Balkans. It's crazy to believe that they will be stuck in Bosnia. And it's inhumane to have Croatian border guards in black uniforms, beat them up at night, steal their mobile phones and push them back into Bosnia. This is not a good system. And in any case, many of them are Afghans. They will not be returned to Afghanistan. They will stay in Europe. So why this cruelty? If we have better control at the external border of the EU, which is the border between Greece and Turkey, or the border in the central Mediterranean, through cooperation with partners from Morocco to Tunisia to Turkey to Ukraine, there's no point for this gratuitous cruelty in violation of our laws in Southeast Europe. So these 5 steps would lead us towards humane borders. If we implement them, and they could be implemented by a coalition of countries, we don't need to have everyone on board. The European Union and these countries would again be a lighthouse for refugee protection globally. And on the 70th anniversary of the Convention, the Geneva Convention on Refugees, this would be an appropriate step for Europe to take. I look forward to your questions and the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Knaus. Could Ms. Asita Kanko perhaps step in and give her opening statement, followed by Mr. Scholler and then Mr. Bieber, and then we'll go to a general debate. We will be taking questions from the audience, so if you do have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll take that shortly after everybody has had their opening statement. Thank you. Asita Kanko.
Thank you very much, James. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, all is fine. As I agree with Mr. Knaus that when the external borders are controlled, then it will have a better impact on the safety and the proper asylum migration policy here. There is still so much to do. And I must say that I have been in the European Parliament now for 2 years, and I think not a lot has moved forward regarding migration policy. And I worry a lot about the coming months. I'm not sure it's going to be moving forward yet. So my belief and what I've noticed is that the EU asylum and migration system is completely broken. And it will become only effective if there is an holistic approach and if people shift from having emotional fights to having rational, constructive conversations. I know it's very difficult because, of course, this is a very hard topic and it's a very harsh situation. But the less we take time to actually speak about the issue and see how to listen to each other and find solutions, the more it's going to become difficult to solve. And the highest the number of victims will be, and the weakest the human smugglers will also become. I believe that a robust external border policy must go hand in hand with an effective program of legal migration. There need to be other ways to come to the European Union, and we also have talents that we need to use for our labor market. I'm happy, therefore, that last week in the Strasbourg session, plenary session, we voted massively for the revision of the EU Blue Card Directive, of which I was honored to be shadow rapporteur, so I had the opportunity to co-negotiate this legislation that will now in the coming 2 years be hopefully implemented in the member states. So it is in line, this idea is in line with what President von der Leyen said during the State of the Union, that we need to use legal migration as well. And she insisted on the fact that we should welcome those who come legally and contribute to our economies. And this would say it enough, because Europe has forgotten to take part in the race for talent. And in the meantime, the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom are actually attracting these talents. And if you go to France, it's much easier to find a job when you are a migrant than in Belgium or in the Netherlands, for example, because they have easier procedures. So the EU Blue Card will make it easier for highly skilled workers from elsewhere to work and live inside the EU with their families. So it makes the EU more competitive compared to other areas in the world, especially as we are very bureaucratic and complicated, speak too many different languages. We need to find other ways of being competitive. But the positive side is, another positive side is that the member states will still be able to set the conditions for granting access to the labor markets so that freedom of decision subsidiarity is preserved. They will also take their own labor market needs into account. And there is minimum salary rules that has been adapted to the real economic situations of the member states. But even if this has been achieved now, the biggest problem, in my opinion, and the most unfulfilled promise of the European Union is how it will be tackling illegal migration. I think that is something that we're not moving forward. And even during her speech, last week in Strasbourg, President von der Leyen admitted the fact that the EU is not moving forward regarding migration policy in that perspective. And I can confirm that, sadly, as member of the Labour Committee, that it has also been my observation. I am now, since the Commission has proposed different topics for, they brought new files, the new EU asylum and migration package, and they have been distributed some of the files. I'm shadow rapporteur for the asylum procedure, and I can confirm that actually nothing happened. Only one, we had coffee during the meetings, notice anything else. And this is very sad because it's quite urgent to change something about that. And I look forward to the colleagues coming back after this Green Week so that we can check what's going on. Of course, the context is that in Germany there are elections, so people are focusing on that. And in France, yeah, there are elections coming up. And I have the impression that this is not going to be a priority for the French presidency starting in January, that they want to focus on other topics. But there is only one way to find out, to ask a parliamentary question to the council and also to the Commission. And this is what we're going to do. Because for us,
can you finish up your opening statement?
Yes, sure, finishing up. I think for us as members of parliament here, it's very difficult because we don't have the initiative to say, look, we are going to change things. We need to follow the pace of the Commission and the Council, and for the moment we're stuck. That's what I can say about this, but at least we move forward regarding legal migration and we'll continue trying to get answers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kanko. Martin Schuller, perhaps you have something to say on the topic of how to improve the situation in Africa and through that reduce illegal migration and find ways of positive legal migration. Martin Schuller, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to contribute a little bit from a geopolitical perspective. I'm very touched what Mr. Knaus also said about the miners, and very impressed by his concrete proposals on Sweden and negotiating deals with other countries. Allow me to make it a little bit worse and then come with bigger picture ideas. I think what we all think that poverty combined with population growth in Africa and totalitarianism regimes that suppress opposition, two big drivers that make people escape. And they're getting worse. We have 700 million people in Africa with €1 per day and without electricity, water, and street. According to United Nations estimates, 200 million want to escape. So it's good that we treat those who are here well, but we have not the capability of 200 million. Also, our Green Party, who's wishing for broad, nice, safe streets, needs to make the whole calculation. Then we have a totalitarian push that is frightening me since 1 or 2 years more than it ever had before, because the countries of growth, such as Russia, Turkey, China, develop into totalitarian, aggressive system that suppress opposition, and that also give reason, and also the Afghans. And then we are seen as a self-service area because we have freedom, peace, and prosperity and human rights. And we have no real political will for defense. And the Americans obviously don't take us serious anymore. They just have formed the AUKUS, AUKUS, no, AUKUS. So America, England, Australia, they don't even ask us. They don't even ask the French. They say, well, these Europeans, they should get their act together. We give an impression to the world like wealthy, decadent, unorganized, and stupid. And that is the invitation for self-service. Let's go there. And we have the awareness to change this. We're discussing our salary to go up from 10 euros to 12 euros. The African salary is 10 cents for 700 million people. So we're discussing that being 100 times richer should now be improved to be 120 times richer. We don't even discuss that Amazon is buying the products outside Germany, outside Europe. We are focusing. We need to take the global view on this challenge, and we need to protect our model and export it. Our model is freedom, peace, and prosperity, human rights, and the absence of extreme poverty. And here come now geopolitical ideas that has been, some of them have been discussed already. Mr. Knaus will say, well, that's old coffee, but I want to bring it up again until I'm convinced that it's not good. I think we should strive for building a city like Hong Kong on the African coast. And I think we should get a UN mandate in Libya where there is chaos and terror and no human rights at all. So we could give a protecting zone, a safe zone, really do a huge investment and build a city that has social standards and anti-corruption standards, good education, and we could bring jobs from Bangladesh and other people there. You want me to stop? You don't hear me?
I hear you, but you just finish up now and we need to move on.
Okay. So I have all my suggestions. Maybe I can bring them later on in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schoeller. Professor Bieber, would you like to step in and give the final opening statement to today's panel discussion?
Sure, thank you. And I very much agree with the previous speakers, and especially Gerald Knaus's practical suggestions, and also Asita Kanko's discussion that we need actually a migration policy in the European Union. And I think part of it, I mean, I want to put it in the framework of the way debate has shifted, and I think this is something which, in addition to the practical suggestions, I mean, the mantra which keeps being repeated is there cannot be a repetition of 2015, which is this kind of mantra put forward by many politicians now. And I think this is really part of the problem of framing migration and refugee in this particular way. Because again, I mean, I think that 2015 is not, first of all, it didn't happen out of the blue. And second of all, is not that anybody is suggesting that that was a desirable process, not because we shouldn't welcome refugees, but because it was a particular set of circumstances which led to it. And I think what shocked me particularly was in the context of the fall of Kabul and the collapse of the American and internationally led effort in Afghanistan, that the main reaction was, well, whatever happens, we cannot repeat 2015, as if in a certain way, the only lens to look at the world is to prevent refugee flows to the European Union, which is a very modest, to put it mildly, way of looking at the world. So it's basically giving up from the European side any attempt to look beyond its borders. And there we see a strong tension. And I mean, I'm speaking here as an academic in Austria, not an Austrian citizen, but in Austria, where there's on one side they say, well, we cannot have more refugees. We cannot even accept. I mean, there was debates in Austria about deporting rejected asylum seekers from Afghanistan days before the fall of Kabul. And even after the fall of Kabul, some leading government politicians said, well, we should negotiate immediately with the Taliban about sending people back, which is, I mean, considering their human rights records, hardly a suggestion in line with European values. So I think what besides specific policies, we need to also realize how far the debate has shifted towards both an intolerance towards any kind of migration in many parts of the European Union, as well as an isolationist perspective on Europe. And I think this is something which needs to shift, not just in terms of specific policy steps, but also in the way we speak about it, in terms of narratives. Now, again, very few would say we need to open borders and welcome everybody, because it's not a practical and not feasible, but we have to have a different story to tell about migration. And one of the key points, which I think is, I agree with Asita Kanko about that we need a migration policy. We need a policy to bring people in and not just discuss, the only way to discuss migration is refugees. And again, this is not a replacement for refugee inclusion. We need policies to provide homes for refugees who are coming to Europe. But at the same time, we also need to find ways of talking about migration in a way in which other immigrant societies do, like Canada, like Australia, like the United States. I mean, again, there are migration policies in place, and Europe is a place of migration, and we have to recognize that. And I think also the other myth about 2015 should not be repeated is the assumption that this was a big failure as well as something fundamentally horrific. Most Europeans, in fact, were quite welcoming of refugees in 2015. This is not how it's thought about today, but it's simply not true to say that there was this kind of panic. And also, in fact, the integration of those who came in 2015 has been mostly a success story. It's not a failure. So it's not a plea to repeat it because it was a one-off, but it's also saying, let's contextualize it. Let's understand 2015 is the result of 2011, namely the civil war in Syria. But if we're actually serious about reducing refugee flows, the European Union has to become a foreign policy actor. It's currently a passive foreign policy player. So in a certain way, what I'm suggesting is, in addition to practical policies to provide for humane treatment of refugees, we have to realize that a lot of the debate is not about refugees at all. It's about how Europe should be constituted as a foreign policy actor, also as a value-driven actor. Because if the European Union is beating refugees at its borders, and these Croatian border guards are acting on behalf of the European Union, or the Greek border guards or others who are mistreating refugees. I mean, as a human being, I should be concerned about the abuse people are suffering, no matter whether they are my co-nationals or what their legal status is. Human rights violations of that scale should not be acceptable by authorities which I pay for as a citizen and as a taxpayer of the European Union. And so I should demand that this shouldn't happen, because I also worry that if that brutalization is possible, well, they could use it against me as well. I mean, again, this is not, we shouldn't think that kind of erosion of values would be completely neutral for us. So I think we have to be combining the concrete policy suggestions with a discussion about norms and values which the European Union stands for. Because I mean, I'm a fervent advocate of European integration, but it's not integration for its own sake, but it's for standing for particular values and legal norms, democracy, which have to be protected and promoted. Otherwise, European integration is meaningless. So we have to be quite clear. So when we have people like Viktor Orban discussing in a demographic conference in Budapest with very few women participating and with no discussion about migration, then I think that's the wrong kind of Europe in terms of the message coming from there. So we need to, in a certain way, reclaim that public space for a different vision of Europe. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Bieber. A number of issues that we'd love to jump into there. I mean, this question of migration. I'm a migrant myself. I migrated from Ireland to Belgium in 1996. Many would not consider me, but that's a fact of the matter. And we are in a race for talent against the rest of the world, really, and we're not maybe doing as well as we should be. We should look to the likes of the United States, which is a country built on migrants and migration, albeit sometimes to the detriment of the indigenous population. But be that as may, we are where we are, and it is welcoming of talented migrants, and we don't have that policy. Becoming a foreign policy actor is one of the biggest challenges facing Europe, because of course we still have the veto right. We have the decision making on foreign policy by unanimity, which kind of handicaps our ability to move forward in that space, and that is perhaps one of the next steps in the revision and fixing of European constitutional setup. Does anyone of our panel want to step in and follow up on Professor Bieber's points before we start to take a question from the floor? Hands up. Asita Kanko, go ahead.
Very short. I'm glad that the AUKUS situation has been mentioned. It's one new situation that reveals the lack of leadership and anticipation capacity at EU level. I was very shocked to see that High Representative Borrell was actually implying that he was not informed. I mean, are we really just waiting for some people to come and tell us what they're planning? Are we not? Is it not our job to actually anticipate this kind of possibility? So it's just worries me, and this is just one element out of so many things that the EU is showing that the EU is not taking leadership, and it includes migration too. And at foreign policy level, like the conflicts in the Sahel or what happened in Afghanistan, these are all situations where the EU should have shown more leadership. And when it's going on like this, the most frustrating place to be is to be in the European Parliament, because you cannot take initiative. You need to wait for the EU to wake up, and we should just go and shake them a week at a certain point.
Gerald Knaus, you want to jump in on there?
Yes, just to make two simple points to follow up. First, it's important to distinguish between migration and refugees. For the debate, it's very useful and very important. Migration, there is no right to migration. Migrants are chosen by countries on who they want to let in. There can be many criteria, professional qualifications, who we need. I mean, Ireland might have different rules for people of Irish origin who can come to Ireland. Spain has those rules for people with Spanish grandfathers in South America. Germany lets in Germans from Eastern Europe. Each country can decide itself who it wants to let in as a migrant. When we come to refugees, it's different. Refugees, of course, because we all signed the Refugee Convention, have a right to be protected. Reducing irregular migration means making it more difficult and discouraging migrants from coming irregularly in humane ways, because we also have, of course, human dignity. It also means finding ways for refugees to be protected. And there it's the difficulty, because again, we don't want to encourage even refugees to take deadly routes. And what we find at the moment is a policy of pushbacks at Europe's borders, from Belarus down to the Mediterranean, from the Aegean to the Balkans, where everybody's pushed back without any checking. This is where the difficulty really lies, but solutions can be found. And my last point, not all these solutions can be found at the EU level of the EU 27. If we would try to agree now on who to let in as migrants, if Ireland and Spain and Germany would need to agree which type of people these societies would want to let in as migrants, we would never agree. The Spanish would have different sensibilities who to give citizenship to from the Irish and from the Germans. And we don't need to agree on this. There are some things we will need to agree on. But so if Germany says we want to bring in through resettlement refugees, like Sweden already does, that doesn't mean that Hungary needs to do it as well. And it makes no sense to force EU countries on some of those issues. But we can have coalitions of countries that go ahead. And then we might avoid what Mrs. Kanko described in the European Parliament, that we have endless debates over 8 years now on proposals which will never be adopted because the member states, in the end, in the Council, have two divergent views. They will not agree for political reasons. Well, then let's see what we can do together.
Super, Mr. Knaus. Martin Schuller, you have your hand raised. Please jump
Yeah.
in.
I was on the same point as Mr. Knaus. I just want to reinforce what you said, that the difference between asylum and migration is not yet clearly worded so that the public notices it in the European policy. It was a mistake by our government to create a joint word migration for both, because I agree, asylum is for a humanitarian reason, a question of temporary protection, and immigration is we can attract talent and we can choose them. And that is on the European level, I think it should be made clearer. Then I have two additional points going to the roots, to the causes. Yeah, we also have terrorism as a reason for escaping. And if I take the IS, the Boko Haram, the Taliban, it's all Sunni terrorists. And we make a lot of business with our Arab partners. So there is a point of negotiation to get much more support, much more co-responsibilities from those who have hundreds, and to get hundreds of billions per year, not just let this problem happening without them making a report on what they are doing. And the second is, you said negotiating with Turkey, Mr. Knaus. We should also negotiate with Pakistan on safety zones for Afghans and maybe support this there. And the third is, and that is in my book, you nicely mentioned it, is we can invest big time in Africa without the taxpayer. And we have at the moment 15 trillion debts, and Americans have 30 trillion debts, double. It costs us nothing with zero interest. So if we put a large amount, we can create up to 50 million jobs in Africa, turn the direction, and do something else which is of high priority, raise the wages so that somebody can feed his family. And as soon as the wage reaches $1 per hour or $10 per day, that's already in South Africa, and it's all over South America, and it's nowhere else in Sub-Sahara, the population growth stops. And on the long term, the population growth with underfed population is another driver of escape. So the big issues for going to the sources should also be part of the European policy.
Thank you, Mr. Schuller, and I can highly recommend Mr. Schuller's book and his thesis that investment, not aid, but investment in Africa can go a long way to stopping some of the root causes of migration, the increase in population, the pressure on resources, and the conflict that arise from it that cause migration to Europe. Who'd like to step in from our panel, or is there anybody from the audience? I did see that Mr. Profazzi joined us from the International Organization of Migration. Mr. Profazzi, I don't know if you would like to make a statement to follow on from the rest of the panel. If so, please put your camera on. No. I think it's interesting to really take into account what Mr. Knaus said, and that is the differentiation between the two sorts of movement of people, refugees and migrants. Migrants, where we have the free will to choose the sort and type and origin of the people that come to our shores and help us and help our economy, and refugees, where we have actually a moral obligation to help and protect and look after from the disaster. Mr. Knaus, go ahead.
Yes, perhaps just to make one more point on this, I think it's also very, very important to have realistic understanding of numbers, of what we're actually dealing with, because a lot of people, I think, use 2015 as a sort of template, and Florian rightly pointed out, 2015 was absolutely exceptional. There was nothing like this in Europe in the last 50 years for a reason. In 2015, the biggest refugee catastrophe in the world, which is the Syrian one, in decades. I mean, since the 70s, there haven't been as many refugees from one country fleeing abroad. The Syrian refugee crisis was at the doorstep of Europe. Turkey had open borders for Syrians, and fortunately it did, because families could leave without a visa from Aleppo, from northern Syria, from Lebanon. They could get on a plane, they could fly to Turkey. Most of them stayed in Turkey. Turkey became the country with most refugees in the world. Now, some of them went on to Europe, and they didn't need smugglers to get to the Aegean. And then they just needed to get into a boat and they could see the Greek islands. This was exceptional. If we look at the situation in the world in the last 4 years, and I just refer to the UNHCR's official numbers of refugees under the UNHCR mandate, which is people who managed to cross a border and were then accepted as refugees. Then the number increased from 2013 to 2020 by around 10 million. 1/3 of them in Turkey, 1 million in Germany. But in the last 4 years, this number worldwide increased by a few 100,000. That means in the last 4 years, worldwide, very few people, refugees, were able to cross any border. Because of those 700,000 more refugees in 4 years, many of them, most of them were actually children born to parents in Germany, in Turkey. They'd never crossed the border either. So borders around the world in the last years have become incredibly difficult to cross irregularly. And we need to repeat this because people need to realize these fears of hundreds of millions or dozens of millions of people crossing borders irregularly, it's not happened in the last 100 years in Europe. Across from Africa, the record year, 2016, which was also unique, it was 180,000 in the central Mediterranean. In the last years, it was a few 10,000 coming from the whole African continent. So irregular migration and the number of refugees, the numbers are smaller, and we would be able to cope with them with a smart policy. We need to get away from the language of waves and streams and physical, naturalistic images of forces that overwhelm us, that we then need to build fortresses and dams. All this language is completely misleading us. If we look at the real numbers, and I wrote a book on this in German, which borders do we need? But I have excerpts of this translated into English, which are freely available online. I'll send the link in the chat if people are interested at looking at the real numbers in the last decades and in the last years worldwide, because then we see problems are solvable.
Mr. Schuller, please go ahead.
Can I put one question to the whole panel and any political informed people in the audience? What is against this obvious idea to build a city like Hong Kong, who was the hinge between Europe and China in Northern Africa, and to try to get a United Nations mandate? And the United Nations are willing to give a mandate if a situation is horrendous. And in Libya, it is horrendous. And one could make a new Carthago and make a beautiful state. People go there, millions can go there. I made the calculation how we can afford it. We can also bring jobs there. Jobs can go back from Bangladesh, could be paid better, and have a concrete, and just being the victim where the whole poverty of the world is pushing on the borders.
We may be able to control those work and jobs better and have a reduced level of child labor in that sort of work too. Ms. Kanko, you raised your hand earlier.
Yeah, of course, it's not related to the question of Mr. Schuller. I just wanted to say that, in fact, when we look at the evolution of the migration policy inside the member states, speaking of asylum, but also on migration, we notice that some member states are moving forward, actually, when they do it on themselves. But at the European level, the coordination is lacking. So what I would like to put in the group here is what your experiences have been from your own perspective inside your own member state, and what you would like to share with me, with us here in this, who are working in the parliament, because of course we have a different perspective. from my experience here in Brussels, my experience is that most people are really not against migration or against refugees. What makes people become skeptical about migration policy is the issue of integration and of adaptation of newcomers to European values. And this is basically the reason why people can become very emotional about migration. And this topic needs to be addressed. I don't know if that's the experience that you also have, but when I listen to French candidates for elections or potential candidates like Eric Zemmour saying, close the borders, let's stop migration, and let's go for assimilation. And people with migration background cannot call their kids by names that are not European names, then it really worries me, because honestly, you don't need to be called Charlotte or Pierre to be European. Look at me, I'm a Sita and I'm European. So I think we need to redefine also what it is to be European, and speak about the values that we're sharing, and that the closed borders or the totally open borders are really both totally extreme, and we need to have a rational conversation. But I'm looking forward to your views from your own.
Thank you very much, Asita, and your suggestions actually appeal very strongly to one of the goals of United Europe, which is the diversity of Europe. And if we don't have diversity, if we all look and sound the same, we'd soon get tired of talking to each other. Let me give the floor to Mr. Profazzi, who is from the International Organization of Migration. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Profazzi. You're coming in at very short notice to replace your colleague, Mr. Henriksen. So please go ahead, and then we'll follow with Professor Bieber.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I'm not just coming in on short notice, but also coming in very late. So my apologies for that. I had a few technical issues here. So apologies also for not then being able to exactly address or reflect on what has already been said. I just could listen in a bit at the end what my colleague Gerald Knaus said at the end. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. I have, since I was asked, as you rightly said, relatively late to replace Ola Henriksen, the regional director in Brussels. I have a very nice speech that I was supposed to give here, but I think I don't do that. It's late here in Geneva, almost 6 o'clock. I think you're discussing already quite some time, so I want to spare you with a long discussion. I can just, if you allow me, give a few highlights and want to stress one point that I don't know, maybe has already been discussed in this context. Or maybe not, but that would be important for me. What I wanted to say actually, and that I understand that the discussion, the focus that you wanted to look at was between security and migration. That at least was my understanding. Now, it would not come as a surprise to you that we are, of course, as IOM, advocating for and lobbying for not to see migrants preliminary as a security risk, rather than being the ones that are most oftenly the ones fleeing from violence and conflict, and are therefore more often the victims of security threats than having to be considered as a security threat or in the security debate. Now, this linkage between security policy and migration, therefore, is, as we see it, a very sensitive one, and it needs to be treated and it's discussed very cautiously. We are not disrespecting that there is a link and that there is value and legitimacy in discussing these issues. It is a sensitive issue, but needs to be, again, treated carefully. What is actually, sorry, you want to interrupt me?
Just maybe wrap up in 1 minute and we move to Mr. Bieber, if you don't mind, Mr. Profazzi.
Yes. What is, however, of great concern to us is the linkage between, where we see a linkage between migration and security policy that is of great concern, and increasingly so, is a geopolitical linkage to it. And what I mean here is that Migration and migrants, in our view, are increasingly instrumentalized. Some say politicized, some say even weaponized in the wider geopolitical and security-related confrontations and debates. I'm thinking of, and I'm speaking of, not surprisingly, what we have seen at the Turkish-Greek border in, I believe, March last year. I'm speaking of what we have seen earlier this year in Ceuta. And I'm speaking very actually right now at the situation at the EU's eastern border with Belarus and the tragic events in recent days. And you might have seen the joint statement of UNHCR and IOM just being released, where we express our deep concerns and condolences about the migrants that have died at this border. And this is the linkage between security and migration that we should, in our view, focus on. Thank you again. Sorry for being long. Sorry for being late. And back to you.
Thank you. And it is heartening to hear the condolences of UNHCR and the IOM, but it's not much use to the families of those migrants that have been that have died on the borders of Europe. We have a couple of questions in that regard from the audience, from Elena Ivanova. We'll get to those, but first Professor Beaver, and then Mr. Knaus, and then perhaps the panel, someone from the panel can address the question from Ms. Ivanova. Professor Beaver.
Yes, I mean, 2 points. The first point is regarding Hong Kong in North Africa. I mean, I think we shouldn't forget Hong Kong was founded as a colonial project in China, and I think this makes it a bit difficult as a comparison, because it was Britain who took the territory rather dubiously from China. So I wouldn't use that as an example, because it wasn't a good starting point. And I think this is the problem. I mean, the risk is now that actually Europe is building a bulwark of dictatorships around its borders, which only purpose is to keep refugees out. And of course, in Libya, this is what has been happening, with different European actors funding different actors in Libya who've been engaging in massive human rights violations. So I would agree with you in the sense that we should invest our resources and energy not into building those who stop refugees with violence and brute force, but those who build good governance and effective states. I mean, that should be the investment, and that's a selfish but also value-based investment. The second point, and that also addresses to Elena Ivanova's question, but also to something which Asita Kanko said. I mean, I fully agree that, of course, refugees and migration are separate topics. We should keep them apart. But I think it's about the debate about, not talking about Europe as a project which is inclusive and not which is exclusive, which is one which, of course, has to treat refugees differently than organizing migration, but it's also about thinking about ways to integrate people into the European polity. And I think, as Asita said, it's about understanding Europe as a place where people who are Asita are just as welcome as somebody called Florian or Gerald, and that these debates we shouldn't leave to the far right populists who have been hijacking this debate and not giving much space to actually this kind of way. And that requires, it doesn't come for free. It requires integration, it requires efforts, it requires also clear understanding of how we integrate, what we want. What do we expect of people who move to Europe? What are those values we expect and which are optional? What is the language requirements? How do we do it? But also, what is the path to citizenship? In a place like Vienna, a fifth of the population have no voting rights because they're not citizens of the country. And it's very, very difficult to become a citizen. So you don't make the offer of integration as a state to those people. And that's a real problem. And that's across Europe in many countries where people don't have a way to actually join that society in the fullest way. And we have to discuss this. And I think this is part of reframing the debate. And this is where I think European values come in, and which cover both questions of refugees and migration, even if I fully agree with Gerald, they have to be kept apart in terms of policy solutions.
It's interesting what you say about the path to citizenship, and it's something that I'm aware of in Ireland. We do have regularly citizenship investitures, and I do suggest that you take the time out to find one of them online on YouTube or whatever, because it's one of the most moving things you can see. It makes me very proud as an Irishman to see those people becoming citizens and becoming proud to be Irish people and to be what we call the new Irish and new Europeans. Mr. Knaus, I'll let you in a second. We've got 6 minutes, everybody, so we'd like to get to wrap up. We will finish on time. Mr. Knaus.
Well, to pick up the point which I was very happy that Mr. Profasi made, and it links also to the question of Elena Ivanova about violations of human rights. I think we have to recognize that the instrumentalization of refugees is nothing new. I will share another link in the chat about what in my book I call the Swiss tragedy, which was, of course, the experience of Jews from the Third Reich, from Germany and Austria, trying to escape to Switzerland. The Nazis instrumentalized them in the sense that there were Gestapo officers who brought them to the Swiss border. Until 1941, the Nazis wanted them to leave. They did everything to make them leave. They brought them to the border. The question was, how did Switzerland react? This was a cruel dictatorship that said to the people they brought to the border, if you come back, we put you in a camp. Now, at that time, Swiss democracy reacted by pushing them back. That was the lesson that led in 1951 in Geneva to the Refugee Convention. No pushbacks of people into danger. So when we talk today about instrumentalization, communist Vietnam worked together with smugglers to put desperate people on boats and send them into the South China Sea. Communist Vietnam instrumentalized people. But when they arrived in Malaysia off the coast and the Malaysian government said, we will not accept them, others, and the UN organized the conference, and others took care of them. They were resettled. What I see today, and I can close on that, is a very, very dangerous language. I would never use the term weaponizing refugees. These are not weapons. These are human beings with rights. The manipulation, the cynical games that were being played or are being played by the Belarusian regime today cannot justify Europe letting people freeze to death at its border. You know, that Lukashenko is guilty, of course, but Europe is not passive. If we then declare a state of emergency and let people stay for weeks in the cold at Europe's border and they die. So let's be very, very clear. We need to find ways to control irregular migration. This will take efforts. You know, to stop Iraq allowing flights into Belarus for then manipulating people, that's a very good thing. That's what European diplomats should do. But to then say, if refugees arrive at our borders, we can ignore their human dignity and view them just as weapons and ignore that they're human beings is a betrayal of every value, every foundation on which Europe stands. So it's not new, and it's very dangerous to fall for this language of weaponization.
It's a great shame on Europe. Mr. Scholler, we have 2 minutes left.
Yeah. No, I want to support Sita. Obviously, Europe doesn't have enough children per wife, per woman. So we need immigration and a qualified immigration with diversity and people who want to come and make Europe more colorful and more full of ideas is welcome. I think there's few people who would not agree with this. So I'm not worried, and many people fight for the support this. I'm worried about the many others that want to come. There's 200 million others because there is such a super difference of poverty. It's factor 100 is the salary and the life expectancy in many countries below 50 years. We have the European model, economic model, and we call it in Germany social market economy. Social market economy takes care of the old, the unemployed, the sick, the children with poor parents, and the worker. And we are not using this wisdom that prevents extreme poverty in our trade. We have so far said trade is to be maximized. In the future, we should say trade is the instrument that helps fight poverty and prevent climate. And to finish this, my proposal is Europe makes a very strong statement in all their international relationships, financing, cooperation, and trade to put in more standards. And the decision makers want Europe. We are much stronger than we believe. All the decision makers from the Arab countries, from the African countries, Eastern countries, come to Europe for their hospitals, for their children, for their holidays, for their shopping and so on. If we tell them you want to come here, you have to do some things. We have more to negotiate.
And we have to negotiate much more strongly with them. Now to finish up, we have a contribution from Ghana, actually, from Shaibu Fusaini. I just want to share with everybody because I think it's important, but then we must wrap up on that because we're out of time. Shaibu works in a EUTF funded project in Ghana, providing youth, women and returnees with soft employable and entrepreneurship skills. It's something maybe for you, Mr. Schuller, to get engaged with. And Shaibu claims that the challenge is that most of these project designs don't work there because it's a top-down approach. And I think that ties in with what you've said in your book, Mr. Schuller, that the investment needs to be as an investment with a business model and work from the bottom up, raising wages and raising living standards. I think we're going to have to close it there, everybody. Many thanks once again to our panel, Mr. Schuller, Mr. Knaus, Mr. Bieber, Ms. Canto, and Mr. Provazzi, and again also to our intern, Matthew Callan, who did all the research and pulled everything together to make this happen. There will be a recording of this shared on our website and on YouTube shortly, and you'll all be informed of it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.